Judge Richard Grayson sat high behind the bench, his polished shoes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The air was thick with the sounds of papers shuffling and the murmur of a dozen cases being called in rapid succession. Richard had been doing this for over 20 years, and the rhythm of the courthouse was second nature to him. He prided himself on being fair and impartial, a stickler for the law, no matter the circumstances. Today, however, felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that Richard couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the oppressive summer heat, or the endless pile of paperwork waiting for him at home. But as he glanced over the docket for the day, his gaze stopped on one name: Naomi Richards. Naomi was listed for a routine traffic violation, speeding, the kind of minor infraction that filled the courtroom daily. Richard had seen her name before, but never thought much of it. The courtroom was full of people, all with their own stories, and Naomi seemed no different from the rest. She had a quiet presence about her as she stood at the front of the room. Her neat, pressed clothes, her calm, collected demeanor. She didn't seem like someone who would make a fuss. Still, Richard noted the strain on her face as she stood before him, almost as if she were bracing herself. The courtroom grew quiet as he called her name. Naomi stood, adjusting the strap of her purse, and walked to the front, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She stood there for a moment, hands clasped in front of her, looking up at Richard with a faint, anxious smile. "Ms. Richards," Richard began, glancing at the details of her violation. "You were caught speeding on Maple Avenue at 10 miles over the limit. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Naomi replied, her voice steady but quiet. Richard raised an eyebrow. He had heard this excuse 1,000 times before, and usually it didn't matter. In his mind, the law was the law, and fines had to be handed down impartially. There was no room for leniency. That was how the system worked. "I see," Richard said, his voice firm. "Given the nature of the violation, I'm issuing a fine of $250. Payment is due within 30 days. Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Naomi hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "No, Your Honor. That's all." Richard nodded, and without another word, the gavel came down with a sharp crack. The decision was made. Naomi's fine would stand. She nodded in acknowledgement and turned to leave, but as she did, Richard noticed the brief flash of frustration that crossed her face. She quickly masked it, but it didn't go unnoticed. As she walked out of the courtroom, Richard's gaze lingered for a moment. There was something about Naomi that didn't sit right with him, something he couldn't quite place. Still, he shook it off. The case was closed, and his job was to uphold the law. No more, no less. But as Naomi exited the room, she glanced back one last time, her expression unreadable. The heat of the afternoon sun clung to Naomi as she walked down the street, her dog, a lively terrier mix named Max, trotting beside her. It was a rare quiet moment in her busy life, a brief escape from the endless responsibilities that seemed to pile on every day. The sidewalk was shaded by large oak trees, the kind that had stood for generations, their thick branches forming a protective canopy over the street. Naomi breathed in the cool air, allowing herself to relax for a brief moment. Max, sensing the peace, pulled ahead, eager to explore the front lawns and scattered bushes. Naomi tugged lightly on the leash, guiding him along. Her thoughts drifted back to the courthouse earlier that morning, the tension of the courtroom still fresh in her mind. The fine, though seemingly small, felt like one more thing she didn't need, another weight added to an already full plate. She had tried to hold her composure during the hearing, but the unfairness of it all gnawed at her. As she approached the corner of her street, Naomi glanced up and noticed a man sitting on his porch, a newspaper open in his hands. He was older, with graying hair at his temples and a thoughtful expression, one that gave the impression of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the world around him. His gaze shifted slightly as he saw Naomi and Max approaching, and a small, polite smile spread across his face. Max, ever the curious dog, darted forward, eager to investigate. Naomi called out, "Max, come back here." But it was too late. The dog bounded up the steps of the man's porch, excited to sniff the new scents of the neighborhood. The man chuckled softly as Max nuzzled his shoes, and Naomi, feeling a little embarrassed, jogged up the steps to retrieve her dog. "Sorry about that," Naomi said, offering a sheepish smile. "He's friendly, but a little too eager sometimes." "No problem at all," the man replied, his voice warm and inviting. "I like dogs. He's got good energy." Naomi paused for a moment, studying him. Something about his face looked familiar, though she couldn't place why. "I'm Richard Grayson," the man said, extending a hand. "I live just a few houses down." Naomi shook his hand, still trying to figure out where she'd seen him before. She managed a polite smile. "Nice to meet you, Richard. I'm Naomi. We must be neighbors, then." Richard nodded. "I suppose so. You live on Oak Street, right?" "That's right," Naomi replied, feeling the sudden shift in the conversation. There was something about this interaction that felt different from the usual small talk. "Good to meet you," Richard said again, still smiling. "Let's hope our dogs get along better next time." Naomi laughed, feeling a bit lighter. "Hopefully," she said as Max tugged at her, eager to keep walking. As Naomi continued down the street, she couldn't help but wonder how this man seemed so familiar, but she didn't dwell on it. The encounter, like so many in this quiet neighborhood, was simple and unremarkable, or so it seemed. The following evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, Richard Grayson sat at his desk, absent-mindedly flipping through a stack of court papers. His mind wandered back to the day's cases, the usual mix of speeding tickets, parking violations, and minor offenses, the kind of day that, for him, felt routine. But then, amidst the pile, he came across a file that made him pause. Naomi Richards. It was a curious coincidence that he had just met her only hours before on his porch. As Richard scanned the document, his eyes narrowed at the details. Naomi had been the woman fined for speeding earlier in the week. The name, the violation, and even the street she was cited on. It all matched perfectly with the woman he had spoken to earlier that afternoon. His heart gave a slight jolt as he connected the dots, the realization slowly creeping over him. There she was, the woman he had fined, the woman he'd judged only days before in the courtroom. And now she was his neighbor. The encounter on his porch suddenly felt awkward, laden with an undercurrent of irony. His conscience began to tug at him. Richard leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. He had never made a habit of second-guessing his rulings. The law, after all, was meant to be impartial. But this felt different. Naomi's face, calm yet tense, flashed before his eyes. He remembered the brief moment of hesitation when he had imposed the fine on her, a fleeting glance that could have been interpreted as something more. A woman who wasn't just guilty of a traffic violation, but a person weighed down by something far bigger than speeding. Richard turned the page of the file, seeing the handwritten notes on her previous court appearances, noting how each one had been settled with the same rigid application of the law. It wasn't unusual. His job was to enforce justice, to remain unbiased. But the question lingering in his mind now was whether this time he had truly been fair. What was it about Naomi that made him feel this way? Was it the way she had looked at him in the courtroom? Or maybe it was how she held herself when she spoke, an air of strength beneath the surface of her quiet frustration. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, the evening light now casting long shadows across his office. The silence in the room was thick with a realization he wasn't quite ready to face. He hadn't simply fined Naomi Richards. He had made a decision without truly understanding her circumstances. Now that he knew her personally, now that she was a face and a neighbor, the weight of that decision felt heavier than it ever had before. His thoughts kept circling back to one thing. Was the law, in its rigid form, enough? Or had he missed something crucial? The next few days felt like a blur to Naomi. Life, as it always seemed to do, marched on with its unrelenting pace. She rose early to get her kids ready for school, then rushed off to her full-time job at the local diner. In between serving customers, cleaning tables, and balancing the busy rush of orders, she squeezed in a few minutes to make calls, appointments for her car repairs, a reminder to the school about a meeting, and the dreaded call to the courthouse about the fine. It was all part of the same unyielding cycle. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a reminder for the fine payment. She had a little more than 2 weeks to come up with the $250, and the pressure of it gnawed at her. She could barely afford the basics with her 2 kids, much less a fine that felt like a punch in the gut. She sighed, leaning against the counter in the kitchen as she sorted through bills, her fingers tracing the balances that didn't add up. She had barely enough for rent this month, and the fine was yet another looming obstacle. The money she earned from her part-time job cleaning houses wouldn't even cover half of it. Her son, Lucas, dashed into the kitchen, asking her to sign a permission slip for a school field trip. Naomi smiled at him, but the exhaustion in her eyes was clear. She signed the paper without looking, her mind still preoccupied with the fine, and the weight it would add to an already tight budget. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Lucas asked, looking up at her with innocent eyes. Naomi nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, buddy, just a little tired. Don't worry about me." But the truth was, she didn't know how she was going to manage. She had worked hard all her life, never asking for much, yet it always felt like something was out of her reach. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, Naomi sat in the quiet of the living room, scrolling through her phone, looking for any possible ways to reduce the fine. She found some local organizations that helped with minor legal fees, but it was a long shot. She thought about calling them, but she knew she couldn't keep relying on others. The real frustration was knowing that, no matter how hard she worked, the system seemed designed to make it harder for people like her to get ahead. Every day, it felt like she was doing everything she could, and yet it never seemed to be enough. She closed her eyes, leaning back against the couch, and let the tiredness wash over her. In that moment, the weight of the fine didn't just feel like a financial burden. It felt like a reminder of everything stacked against her, everything that life kept throwing her way. And in that silence, Naomi felt more alone than ever. Richard Grayson couldn't sleep. The darkness of the night seemed to press in on him as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fan above him hummed softly, but it did little to cool the heat of his thoughts. His mind kept circling back to Naomi Richards. The more he thought about her case, the more his discomfort grew. She had become more than just another name on a file, more than just a traffic violation. She had become real, personal, and in a way, he was starting to feel responsible for her burden. The evening before, after seeing her name on the court papers, he had tried to move on, telling himself it was just another case. But something about their brief encounter, her calm, collected demeanor despite the weight of the fine, had stuck with him. He had seen countless defendants in his career, yet there was something in Naomi's eyes that made him question everything he thought he knew about fairness. He had been so quick to impose the fine in court, so quick to apply the rules as he always had. But now, in the stillness of the night, Richard wondered if that was enough. Was it enough to simply follow the law when the circumstances of a person's life weren't even considered? Naomi's case wasn't just about speeding. It was about a woman struggling to balance work, family, and financial hardship. Did he really understand the complexities of her situation? Richard sat up in bed, his thoughts growing more restless. He had always prided himself on being fair, on being above personal bias, and yet now he felt unsure. The law, as he had always believed, was meant to be impartial, but had he been so focused on the rules that he had forgotten the people behind the cases? He couldn't shake the image of Naomi standing in front of him in that courtroom, her quiet frustration evident. The next morning, Richard found himself distracted at work. He went through the motions, calling cases, issuing rulings, but his mind wasn't fully present. He couldn't stop thinking about Naomi. He thought about the burden she was carrying, about her determination to make ends meet. He thought about how easy it had been for him to make a judgment without understanding her story. By midday, Richard couldn't take it anymore. He found himself standing by his office window, staring out at the street below, watching people go about their day. He could no longer ignore the sense of guilt that had settled in his chest. He had to do something. He grabbed his coat, his decision made. He didn't know how, or even if it would help, but he couldn't ignore the responsibility he felt. He had to make it right. It was late afternoon when Richard finally stood at Naomi's doorstep, his hand hovering over the doorbell, unsure whether this was the right move. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with thoughts of how she might react. Would she be angry? Would she think he was just another person who didn't understand her struggles? He had never felt this uncertain before, especially when it came to matters of the law. Taking a deep breath, Richard rang the doorbell. A few moments later, Naomi appeared at the door, a look of surprise flashing across her face when she saw who it was. "Judge Grayson?" Naomi asked, her voice cautious but polite. "What brings you here?" Richard forced a small smile, trying to mask the discomfort he felt. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I'm Richard Grayson. We met the other day. I live a few houses down." Naomi's brow furrowed for a moment as she tried to place him. Then recognition hit. "Oh, right. The judge. You were the one who find me," she said, her words guarded but not unkind. Richard nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "Yes, that's why I'm here," he said, pausing to gather his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about the fine I imposed on you, and I wanted to personally apologize. I don't think I'd fully understood your situation when I made that ruling. And to be honest, I've been feeling guilty ever since." Naomi's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and skepticism crossing her face. She stood there for a moment, silent, as if trying to process his words. Richard could see the tension in her posture, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze calculating, but also something else. A flicker of vulnerability, perhaps, or the beginning of curiosity. "You don't have to apologize," she finally said, her voice steady but guarded. "The law is the law. It's not easy, you know. Things have been really tough lately." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I understand," he said, his voice earnest. "But that's just it. The law might be clear, but sometimes it's easy to forget about the human side of things, the people we're affecting. I wasn't thinking about your circumstances when I made my decision, and for that I'm sorry." There was a long pause before Naomi spoke again. "What do you expect me to do with this apology?" she asked, her tone slightly wary. Richard took a step forward, his voice softer. "I don't expect anything from you, Naomi, but I wanted you to know that I see you, and if there's anything I can do to help with the fine or anything else, I want to do it. I just felt like I had to make this right." Naomi's gaze softened for the first time. She took a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "More than you know." Over the next few days, the conversation between Richard and Naomi lingered in both of their minds. Richard couldn't help but replay their exchange over and over. The weight of the apology had felt freeing, but it was clear that his gesture hadn't fully resolved the tension that hung between them. Naomi's words, though kind, had been cautious, as if she were still processing the complexity of the moment. Naomi, on her end, had found herself torn. She had spent the last few years building up walls around herself, trying to shield her family from the harshness of the world. So when Richard had shown up at her door with an apology, it was both unexpected and, in a way, disarming. She hadn't known how to react at first. She had expected judges, especially ones like Richard, to remain distant, unwavering, and unemotional. Instead, he had approached her as a person, not just as a judge with a gavel and a decision. But despite her initial hesitation, Naomi couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief that for once, someone had acknowledged her struggles. As the days passed, their brief encounter continued to weigh on Naomi. At the diner where she worked, she served coffee and pancakes with her usual smile, but her thoughts often wandered back to Richard's visit. Could he really help her with the fine, as he had said? And if so, would that mean accepting charity from someone she barely knew? Was it worth the risk of opening herself up to a system she had grown to distrust? Meanwhile, Richard found himself walking past Naomi's house more often than he cared to admit, his thoughts constantly circling back to her. He had made a decision that day, an apology that, he hoped, had been more than just a gesture. He wanted to make a difference in Naomi's life, even if it was just in a small way. The fine wasn't just a legal issue for her. It was part of a much larger pattern of obstacles that had been stacked against her for years. Richard knew that this one action couldn't fix everything, but perhaps it was a step toward bridging the gap between a system that often felt cold and a person who just needed to be seen. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, a sudden thought hit him. The fine wasn't just about money. It was about a recognition of the burdens that people like Naomi carried every day. Richard reached for his phone and typed a brief message. "If you'd be open to it, I'd like to help with the fine, in any way I can." He hit send, feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety. This wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't even close to fixing the underlying issues that had led Naomi to this point. But maybe, just maybe, it would show her that the law wasn't always a distant force. It could, at times, be a force for good. Richard put the phone down and waited, his thoughts now on the possibility of a future where both of them could find some semblance of peace in their unlikely connection. Naomi stared at the phone in her hands, her thumb hovering over the message Richard had sent. "If you'd be open to it, I'd like to help with the fine, in any way I can." The words seemed almost too simple, yet they carried a weight that was hard to ignore. She had read them over and over, each time feeling a mix of disbelief and uncertainty. Was this really happening? Was Richard Grayson, her judge, the one who had fined her just days ago, offering to help? She set the phone down on the kitchen counter and paced the small living room, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on handling things on her own, never relying on anyone, especially not someone in a position of authority. The idea of accepting help felt foreign, yet there was something in his message, in his genuine tone, that made her pause. For a long moment, Naomi simply stood still, her thoughts consumed by the weight of her decision. She had been fighting for so long, scrimping and saving, always just a step away from drowning in bills and responsibilities. The fine had been the final straw, a reminder of how close she was to losing control. But Richard's offer, his willingness to reach out in a way no one else had, felt like a lifeline. After a few deep breaths, Naomi picked up her phone and typed her response. "Thank you. I wasn't sure what to make of your visit, but I appreciate the offer. Let's talk." It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. Richard had shown her a side of the law she hadn't expected, a side that cared. It was still a long shot, but maybe this was her chance to find a way out of the constant struggle, even if just for a moment. Later that evening, the two met at a small coffee shop near Naomi's home. When Richard walked in, he spotted her immediately. She was sitting at a corner table, her eyes still guarded but softened by something he couldn't quite place. As he approached, she stood up, and they exchanged a quiet greeting. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," Richard said, his voice sincere. "I didn't want to just offer help without knowing if it was something you'd want." Naomi nodded, offering him a faint smile. "It's not easy for me to ask for help," she admitted, her voice tinged with hesitation. "But I can't keep doing this on my own." Richard took a seat across from her. "I understand. And that's why I'm here. No one should have to carry everything by themselves, especially when they've been put in situations beyond their control." As they spoke, a sense of understanding began to form between them. Richard's offer wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about acknowledging Naomi's struggles, her resilience, and her need for a hand to hold, even if just for a moment. They talked for hours, about the weight of the system, about their shared humanity, and about what it meant to truly see one another. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there was no magical fix to the challenges Naomi faced. But in that moment, they found something rare, an understanding that could bridge the divide between the law and life's messy realities. It was a small step, but for both of them, it felt like the beginning of something new. As they said their goodbyes, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet belief that maybe things didn't have to be so hard. Not always. Not if people were willing to see each other, truly see each other, beyond the roles they played.